Welcome to City Skylines 2. This is my beginner's guide for new or returning players, and I'm not going to muck you around with a long-winded introduction, so with time cards below, let's jump in. The very first step, a quick one but an important one, is to choose a map. Here you really want to pay attention to the details down in the bottom right. In particular, of course, you're looking at the theme and climate, i.e. if you want a city that gets covered in snow, then you better make sure you have the temperature for it. Likewise, another thing to focus on, buildable area. City Skylines 2 has a lot of area that can be a little bit difficult to build on, might need quite a bit of terraforming, for example, if you want to really fit stuff in. So make sure you choose a space that has a high buildable area and also maybe some natural resources too, if you're looking for a certain type of city, a certain economy, or look and feel. Once you've made your choice, you can always change the theme from European or North American. Of course, you're a civilized person, so you'll turn left-hand traffic on, you can name your city, and ultimately, if you'd like to play on more of a creative mode, you can choose to have everything unlocked and unlimited cash money. Now it comes to part 2, laying the foundations, and you're probably going to start with something that looks a little bit like this. A road coming from seemingly nowhere into some buildable land, and now we're tasked with building a basic roading network and providing some core services to our future citizens. Everything from roads to power lines to public transport, mass transit networks that reach outside of your city boundaries, these white dotted lines, are essentially connected to the outside network. So you don't need to worry about doing anything once it stretches beyond that line. If you feel like you need more space, of course, we will be able to purchase more tiles and expand as we move through. More on that in a little bit. But first, let's talk about roads. So you're probably going to want to connect from the outside world, from those highways, with as large a road as you can get. To begin with, it's these medium-sized roads. I like to place some of the new roundabouts at a couple of points, not too much though. We don't want to congest our artery route all that much. And then coming off of that, using probably some of the smaller roads, you could experiment with some one-way ones to create some closed networks. And along these, we might also use the new grid tool to build some easy blocks that we can fill with residential zones or whatever else we may or may not be placing inside of them. As you start to place your roads and build your city, there's one really important thing that you should check, actually a couple. They're buried up the top here in the info views section. Probably the most important would be to put on something like the air pollution lens and see what way the wind is blowing, the predominant wind direction, because this will be the way that, for example, air pollution from your factories will blow. So you're going to want to make sure that your residents are upwind and that your factories and your industrial output is downwind. And I think that's really important to mention here at the start. Of course, other implications and sort of other factors will be at play here as well, such as noise pollution from zoning. You might also want to check for underground aquifers, for water and natural resources. We'll return to these things a little bit later though. For now, the most important thing is to see what way the wind is blowing. And now with our basic roading network down, the only thing left to do for our foundation stage is to start doing some basic zoning, which of course can be found down the bottom here. Initially, there are only 3 types available to us, fairly simple, but we will unlock some sweet ones later on, don't worry. And we can also get a little bit more of a detailed view down the bottom here, a little assessment of the demand and the kinds of impacts or implications that that demand has. Initially though, it's pretty straightforward. Right, we need to get some citizens in here, so let's zone some areas for some low-density residential. And as people start to move in, that will of course increase demand for commercial areas like shops and industry. As a general rule of thumb, I like to put, as we've talked about, the citizens, the people, the dwellings, downwind, and industry upwind. I also quite like to put commercial zones somewhere in between, so that industry up here, for example, could supply shops down on this block, which could supply people down here. We keep things nice and separated so that we avoid some of the negative noise, air, ground pollution impacts of these industry zones up here, and hopefully everybody is happy, because of course happiness matters here too. More on that in a little bit. As we start to meet our demand, some very basic, core, essential needs will start to develop, and they all work a little bit differently than they used to in City Skylines 1. Let's start down here with electricity or power. We have an outside connection coming in from beyond our city. Regardless of whether we have that or not though, one new thing that we'll need is this, a transformer station, converting high voltage power into the low voltage current that we need to supply our buildings. So at the very least, we need to place one of these down and then probably navigate to the big power line and connect that bad boy up. And now we have high voltage power coming in from the outside of our city, being converted into power that we can use. And just like that, it's automatically connected. Because, thankfully in cities too, the road networks, everything except highways, carry power. They have the power lines underground, so everything is automatically hooked up there. Importing power can be pretty expensive though, so if you're looking to save a little bit of money or maybe build up your own resilience, early on there aren't too many options. Wind turbines might be useful if you're not building on a completely flat, plain island like I am. Alternatively, a small coal power plant will generate a lot of electricity. You'll actually probably be able to connect it to this network and export it out to make a little bit of cash. Important to note that infrastructure like the coal power plant will also need to be hooked up using these power lines, so make sure that you connect it within your city limits to your existing infrastructure. Next up is water, where we have 3 options, and I'd also like to note here that, of course, because we have options, they have different costs. Not only the initial cost, in this case 25k, but also a monthly upkeep. So it's important to make note of this as you're doing your planning. We'll talk more about the economy later though. For now, let's focus on getting these people a damn glass of water. First and foremost, there is the water pumping station. This bad boy will suck water straight out of the sea for your people. And much like the air pollution, you'll want to pay attention to what way the water is predominantly flowing, because we're also going to use a similar method, although in this case an outlet, for our wastewater. A sewage outlet will likely be the place where we'll start. So for the sewage outlet, I of course want to place it so that it's flowing out downstream. So maybe over here, so that it can just sort of flow out that way away from my city. And of course, the opposite is true for the water pumping station, maybe somewhere a little bit more upstream. Connecting water and wastewater works a little bit differently here too, with combined pipes an option for relatively easily connecting both water and wastewater. As you can see, it puts me into the underground view. Now in this case, I just need a water pipe, so it could almost be easier to just connect one over. I find it a little bit easier to keep track of everything, make sure that the pipes are actually snapping in the correct place and not accidentally being placed adjacent where they're just not hooking up. But when it comes to connecting to places like this, of course you'll notice that automatically the pipes are laid under the ground wherever all non-highway roads are placed. Your other 2 water options are water towers. These are much more expensive, but very easy to place. You don't need to worry, for example, about connecting a road up like we did with this water solution. We can just plop this bad boy down wherever we like. And then there's the cheaper, but more finicky option of groundwater pumping. In this case, of course, I'm looking for groundwater deposits to pump water out from, so there needs to be a specific location for it, and I want to make sure it's away from possible pollution too. Now, as I complete actions, such as simple things like placing roads, as you can see, for +3 experience, and of course, more advanced things, certain buildings, growing the city, that kind of thing, we'll progress through Cities Skylines development tree, or its progression system. In this case, every time we level up our town from, village to town to city to metropolis, we'll get some development points to spend. A few basic tips that I could give from the start. You might want to look at some advanced road services, like, for starters, roundabouts, then probably large roads, intersections, maybe highways as well for an extra outside connection. Power, you should be relatively all right at the start. Likewise for water. Crematorium, frankly, will save you a great deal of space. For starters, I think maybe focus on some basic healthcare, some basic power if you need it, or some crucial road developments. Progressing through each milestone doesn't just deliver some sweet new unlocks and development points. As you can see, it also unlocks a variety of other things like specialized industry, new housing types, as well as extra cash money. As you move through the milestones, you should find that you have a nice balance of cash to, generally speaking, probably kind of grab what you like, so long as you're running a reasonably effective city. And down the bottom left here on map tiles, you can see that basically from the start, or at least from very early on, we can start to buy some of the many many tiles available in City Skylines 2, and we're going to need them. I mean, look, we've almost already filled up a good, kind of third to half of the space that we've got here. So clearly these are kind of a must rather than an optional extra in this game. I would note that you could, if you want to, reach out and buy tiles that aren't actually directly adjacent to the ones you already have. So maybe I wanted to build up here on the mainland or next to this river delta. Well, I could do just that by buying literally all of those tiles up there. Now, is that very useful to me right now? Well, it could be for natural resources, connections, that kind of thing. So you might want to factor that in as you grow and expand through City Skylines 2's revamped progression system. As your city begins to grow, you'll start to notice the needs of your people begin to change. And, of course, as you progress through these milestones, you'll start to unlock new city services, new buildings like the crematorium we talked about earlier, but also you'll start to notice new needs for your people, like education, like waste management. So let's talk a little bit now about some of the more advanced city services and how that factors in to the happiness simulation taking place. Happiness can be tracked very easily at any point down in the bottom right, as well as with some different overviews and overlays, but essentially, you want to try and make sure that your city or town is as happy as it can be. That will attract more people, more business, more money, everything that you want to bring. In this case, of course, we want things like spacious homes, wealth. We don't like unreliable service coverage. So, let's get some basic services down. And this, of course, goes above and beyond the sort of power, water, and sewage. In this case, we're talking about things like healthcare and death care, like waste management, for example, which also sees a slightly more revamped model, allowing you to draw out the specific zone around the landfill. Again, take care to keep it away, probably from where people are living, unless you want them to have a miserable time. And then we'll also extend this through into things like education as well. Essentially, make your way along the bottom, and of course, we'll continue to cover everything else along there. And you should be able to provide everything that you need for your people. Make sure you have adequate coverage and connections too. Most of these facilities can also be upgraded in City Skylines 2 for extra capacity. This elementary school getting upgrades providing extra well-being, much more student capacity, and extra health for students too. So we can future-proof ourselves a little bit by ensuring that these are both placed in a good position around where people live, maybe by connecting underground roads, for example, using page up and page down to connect extra areas of the city, and of course public transport networks and that kind of thing that we'll touch on in just a little bit. Your emergency services will also, of course, play a vital role. This includes fire and rescue, as well as police and administration. Now, in terms of the very basics, you'll be totally fine with just a police station and a firehouse. Take a look as I hover the firehouse over this road here. You can see it has great coverage across literally my entire little town, and you'll find that the police station is much the same. If I place it across the road there, generally speaking, bam, there it goes. It'll cover everything. So we get great coverage from these very early services, and of course, as I mentioned earlier, we can upgrade it as well with a little bit of extra capacity down the line. So we should be fine for the most part for these early unlocks and early service provision. Providing great services for people as well as the necessity will, as you see, increase their overall happiness, and this will increase the demand for new development and new growth in our city, something you'll be constantly fighting, particularly perhaps on the industrial front. Unlocked at Milestone 4, another way to make sure that our citizens are kept happy is through the always wonderful watch, parks, and recreation. Now, inside of this window, of course, we'll progressively unlock more and more things like sports parks, tourist attractions to bring even more people to our city. But to begin with, and probably the best example is just to take a look at a basic park, let's say a small playground. Connected to a road, of course, for best access and use, though not initially required like most things. If you just want to plop it down, these will add value to the area, increasing land value potentially, and of course they'll also give people something to do. They'll act as a proper source of happiness. And once you've placed them down, you might also want to take a look at the landscaping menu down the bottom here as well. Inside of this menu, you'll get access to the terraforming tools, which are very good inside of City Skylines, allowing you to potentially level out ground, maybe just completely gobble up some new land if you want to. You could even make it in the shape of a pineapple tree or a banana or the world or whatever you want to do. More importantly, though, we also get access to vegetation, where we have ultimately a huge place multiple tool here, just like was modded into City Skylines 1. If you want to really fill the land, Otherwise, you could place them individually. Ultimately, it's up to you. Let your creative juices run wild. Much like how citizens' individual lives are simulated in City Skylines 2, so is the timing, the weather, the look and feel of the map, and the growth of things like trees. So as we plant these down and maybe come back to them later on, they'll grow, of course, into something bigger and stronger, and ultimately change with the seasons too, changing the color of their foliage and that kind of thing. Now let's talk advanced zoning types, and there are 3 key things I want to cover here. Firstly, we'll start to get access as we move through to more dense housing. This will of course create the larger buildings, the kinds of things that you can see developing here down Poop Lane, for example. We'll also get access to more advanced commercial buildings over time with extra density. Industrial zones we'll touch on in a minute through specialized industry. And finally, a new office zoning type is also available. And we'll want to queue this up, place some down maybe in and around where our educated peoples live. They don't tend to pollute too much. We could put them near schools, in our CBDs, that kind of thing. The next thing to remember is to keep zoning around ground pollution, around residential sustainability, all of those kinds of things that you can check here while you're in the zoning sort of overview menu. You want to make sure that things aren't too congested, that industry is again downwind. Keep all of these things in mind as you continue to grow. Speaking of grow, the 5th and final tab to grow out of the zoning menu is of course the specialized industry menu that I mentioned earlier. When you click into a certain type, you'll get of course a great overview of the map. You'll be able to see the areas that are really most productive or most efficient for maybe grain farming. Or perhaps you're more interested in the primary industry resource extraction, something like stone mining. Well, either way, of course, you can zoom out, maybe keep your eye on some tiles that might have really productive areas, and then focus down in on actually producing this special type of industry. For this example, we might use grain farming. So I can see that this area here will be ideal for grain farming. You can get a sort of a sense and a feel for it, of course, by the color overview. Well, let's place it down. And then, of course, we can ring fence out an area, just like we could do earlier with our landfill. It's broadly speaking a new thing for City Skylines 2. I know some of these things, of course, are repeats or they've been modded, all that kind of stuff. But once we've ring fenced a little area, that will get to work. It adds a really nice feel to the city as well. You can get some really good looking things out of this. So make sure you keep that in mind as you grow and expand. The specialized industry will also help with the economic simulation. Let's take a look at that now. Now, down the bottom over towards the right-hand side of the screen, you'll see the City Economy button. And this one, of course, is pretty important. Now, don't be worried early on if your monthly balance is a little bit low. We will have things like government subsidies, basically free money for us, as well as, of course, the money that we're making to try and counterbalance it. But if you have a lot of services online and not yet a huge population, you might expect to run a bit of a monthly deficit. Of course, you could choose to take out a loan to try and meet some of that with extra repayment. Alternatively, we could move here to the taxation screen, where you can adjust education-based taxation, a little bit unusual, or just overall for residential, commercial, industrial, and office groups. And if you'd like to get really specific, you can focus in on certain industries. As some general advice, lowering your taxes will hopefully increase employment, business profitability, that kind of thing. You should see a more thriving business community. However, that will of course come at a cost to your bank account. So you need to play very carefully. I would suggest not raising it too high, above 13-ish%. On the 4th tab, service budgets can also be adjusted. So if you think, you know what, these roads are just too nice, well, you can slash the services budget in half, saving you maybe a little bit of cash money. Take note of each of these different budgets, but don't stress too much about the finer details, because finally, speaking of details, on the production tab, you can see all of the goods and services, at least the main ones that are being simulated inside of our economy. For example, we're producing 33 tons-ish of grain. We have no surplus, and we have a huge deficit. And that means, as you can see, that we're importing quite a lot of grain. So I might want to focus in on that, or perhaps livestock. Alternatively, if I want to produce an excess of something, we can sell it into the open market, and that will help us make some money too. And of course, here again, we can focus in on all kinds of different types of goods. It's not just those specific industries, but also the kinds of raw materials that you might expect a growing city to need, like beverages and convenience food, for example, as well as all of the other immaterial goods. And as a very quick side note on your economic progress, you can of course choose to get updates from Chirper here in the interface menu. It will be on by default to get those pop-ups. If you want to turn it off, that's the way you do it. And the reason, of course, is because it will pop up a lot if you're playing on the faster speed. I thought I'd just quickly throw that in there. It is a useful way to try and capture how your people are thinking and feeling, but it could get just a little bit much. As you begin to grow and expand, you also might want to take advantage of the Areas tool, or more specifically, the District tool. Here you can draw or create specific districts and zones within a city. So here, for example, there's a very small new residential development taking place. So if I capture it quickly inside of what has been named Aspen View, as you can see here, we can then look to change certain things within it. We could, for example, add speed bumps to slow down traffic, reduce collisions. Alternatively, a roadside parking fee might be useful for maybe a CBD or more productive area. We could encourage them to be greenies by recycling and reducing their energy consumption. There are plenty of local policies on offer for us to choose from. This tool is probably especially useful though for allocating services as well as specialized industries. So for example, here in Aspen View, I've placed down a medical clinic because the old one all the way over here just wasn't really quite cutting it. Now, what I could do is click on this medical clinic and then select operating districts. Select Aspen View and bam. Now, this medical clinic will service this area and this area exclusively. So we can target demand specifically to reach maybe hard to access, more exclusive or more remote areas. And finally, when it comes to growing a more advanced economy at least, make sure you take note of all of the different info views, because you might find as you grow that some things are becoming less available, like for example, electricity, which at the moment my city is simply not producing enough of. Also, of course, service provision, the attractiveness of your city, the overall value, happiness, all of these things. Make sure you keep an eye on it to nip any issues that might appear early in the bud. And now on growth, the kind of bigger level growth. As I expand out and purchase more and more tiles, let me leave you with some parting tips and tricks and lessons on some of the basic fundamentals for growing big. Obviously, city simulation is all about moving people around so they can move around, make money, get educated, live their lives, whatever it may be. And there are some more advanced road tools that you could look to take advantage of, like the Road Maintenance Depot, to help keep your roads maintained and in order. Alternatively, you could look to directly mess with traffic flow by adding things like no straight ahead, no left turns, stop signs, traffic signals, or more decorative pieces to your roading networks. You'll also unlock things such as parking lots. These can, of course, be very useful in maybe areas of high commercial activity, near specific attractions like the botanical gardens here, or maybe near vital services such as the high school, for example. Here I can bowl down a building and put a little parking lot next door. We, of course, have plenty of different options on offer, and these will want to accompany, these sort of more advanced road tools will want to accompany two other key pieces of urban design. The next thing to focus on might be active transport. So if we have people living in very dense areas, how can we connect them outside of roads to hopefully reduce the inevitable and large traffic burden that will start to make our cities become very cumbersome and not all that productive? As you can see, these pedestrian alleys or streets in the middle here are a step up from the normal footpath. You can, of course, even place buildings alongside of them, like parks or residential buildings, all of that kind of stuff. So not only do they connect people, but we can also connect people in different ways. Mass transport or public transportation being one of the key ways that we can look, of course, to actively connect people, both domestically and bring in international visitors, like through the use of this airport, which is just absolutely massive, by the way. You're going to need at least 2 tiles or something. The easiest places to start are probably with something like a taxi depot, a bus depot, or maybe some dedicated transport lanes in and around your city. These ones will, of course, service both domestic goods and hopefully some tourists, and then you can move through into things like trains, which will also handle cargo and freight. Start by placing down a depot somewhere maybe slightly convenient and handy, and then you can use bus stations and bus stops, bus shelters to essentially draw networks in and around your city. Once you've placed your shelters though, make sure you actually use the Line Connect tool. This will actually generate a public transport route, so those shelters and that bus depot or whatever it may be will actually be actively in use and hopefully patrolling an area that's useful for you in and around key public services, transport features, workplaces, attractions, that kind of thing. And that, my friends, brings us to the end of the video. Thank you so much for joining me today. I hope that you've learned something new as a new or maybe returning player to City Skylines 2. Let me know your extra tips in the comments below. I'll see you next time.